On behalf of the staff of Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation with Lily Geismer and Margaret O'Mara. Geismer's book, Left Behind, The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality, is the subject of tonight's talk. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are so glad to have you join us tonight. The presentation will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To submit your question for the Q&A portion of the event, please enter meet.ps/Geismer or scan the QR code right now on the screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat as well, and you can submit a question at any time. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. You can help by keeping your own question concise. And as a reminder, if you'd like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of your video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Coming up, future forecaster Jane McGonnell and Margaret Morris discuss strategies for envisioning our future lives and solving problems with creativity. And art crime expert Aaron L. Thompson talks about the rise and fall of America's public monuments. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates as more events and programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation and True Brown Foundation. Town Hall is also a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members who are joining us. If you share in Town Hall's goal of a community energized and empowered by considering questions of politics, science, and culture, please consider supporting us by becoming a member. You'll find membership information on our website. Lastly, you'll absolutely want to dive deeper into tonight's topic by purchasing your own copy of the author's book. Please use the link in the chat or visit our table over there to get your copy through Third Place Books. Lily Geismer is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College, where she teaches courses on recent urban and political history. She has earned fellowships from the Carnegie Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University. She is also a member of the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians. Her previous book is Don't Blame Us: Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, Democracy, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. She has appeared on NPR's 1A with Joshua Johnson, The Sam Cedar Show, WBUR's Here and Now, and other podcasts. Margaret O'Mara is the Howard and Frances Keller Professor of History at the University of Washington. She writes and teaches about the history of U.S. politics, the growth of the high-tech economy, and the connections between the two. She is the author of The Code, Pivotal Tuesdays, and other books. She is a frequent contributor to the opinion section of the New York Times, and her writing also has appeared in the Washington Post, Bloomberg Business, Newsweek, and other publications. Previously, she worked in the Clinton White House and served as a contributing researcher at the Brookings Institution. Please join me in welcoming Lily Geismer and Margaret O'Mara.
All right, hi. Lily, it's so great to be here with you. Hello, everyone here. Hello, everyone in cyberspace. I'm Margaret O'Mara. And it is such a pleasure to be here talking about, here's my prop, the new book, Left Behind, which is this really extraordinary and timely and distinctive new contribution to our corpus of political history and explaining a period in the history that wasn't that long ago, the 1990s and the decades before, and with so much resonance of what's happening now. I told Lily and I have known each other for a while, and because we study some similar things, but before I was a historian, I did work in the Clinton administration, and I did work on a number. As I was reading this book, I felt it was this is your life flashing before my eyes. But one of the, what I told Lily backstage just now is that she really nailed it. It's very hard to not be there in the room, and you really captured these, the context and the compromises and the forces that are shaping policymaking, and particularly social policy and policies designed to address economic inequality and poverty. So kudos to you. This is a really, really important book, and I think it's one that we're going to be talking about for a long time. So I'm honored to be here talking with you about it. So I wanted to start by asking you, why did you write this book?
Well, thank you. It's hard to now talk after you give me such a favorable review, but it's wonderful. This is such a joy to even to come to up from LA and get to share a stage with Margaret, who I admire immensely. So I'm very pleased to be here. I wrote the book for a few different reasons. One was, as was mentioned, I wrote another book called Don't Blame Us. And at the end of that book, which was looking at suburban liberals, it looked at Mike Dukakis's political career, which sounds like a snooze fest to many people, but he's a really interesting figure. And one of the things I became interested in as I was working on it was how increasingly he was part of a cohort that was using the market, increasingly using market-oriented thinking. And so it fascinated me that this was coming from the Democratic Party, and I wanted to understand it. The other thing that I was interested in this is that so much of the political history of the period since the 1960s is really about the Republicans and this kind of story of the Republican dominance and rise to power. And oftentimes the way the story of the Democratic Party's embrace of more market-oriented thinking is told as if it was reaction to the Republicans. And so the classic way of thinking about this is sort of taking Bill Clinton's idea of triangulation, which was sort of dominant in the Clinton era and the 96 campaign, and sort of thinking about this was just Democrats like Bill Clinton stealing an idea from Republicans to win elections. And in my mind, there was a more complicated story going on, and so I wanted to kind of understand why Democrats had started increasingly use the market. The final reason, the other thing that motivated me to write the book was my own students and teaching. I had a lot of students, especially in from like 2000 to 2010 to 2014, who wanted to do good, but their way of doing good was by working in the private sector. And it interested me that these were all people who were Democrats, and why it was that sort of young people the way in which they saw an outlet of doing good was to work in the private, not the public sector. And so I wanted to understand the period before that to sort of think about what ideas had sort of helped to shape that kind of thinking. So that combination of things is what led me to write this book.
That's great. You know, one of the things that you discuss in the book is how as these self-styled new Democrats or centrist Democrats were putting these ideas out into the world starting in the 1980s in earnest, that they were criticized as being, Ronald Reagan light or just reacting to Reagan. And one of the important things that you're doing here is it's not just a reaction to the so-called Reagan Revolution. Can you talk more about kind of why Democrats were gravitating towards these solutions, not just reacting to a new conservatism?
Yeah, and that was a critical idea of the book, is to sort of say that this isn't just reactive, that there's an affirmative project going on. And the really big thing is they genuinely believed in this. So the book tracks so it predates Clinton, beginning in the 1970s with a group of Democrats who go through like a variety of different terminology. It's like this, they basically them and the press couldn't figure out what to call them, so they keep coming up with new names for them. But they start out as being called Watergate babies, and so it's a group of primarily white men who from suburban districts who come into office in 1974 in the aftermath of Watergate. And their reaction actually isn't necessarily to Nixon. It's actually more to changes in the Democratic Party, that they're frustrated with the status quo of the Democratic Party. And in a sense, the Democratic Party was too big and bureaucratic and also too beholden to what they thought of as special interests, especially to the labor movement. The other thing that is really critical in shaping their turn to the market, so they see the market as more efficient than the kind of bureaucratic big government programs that Democrats traditionally supported. So under the Great Society or under the New Deal. The other thing that's really important and why they turn to the market in that moment is that it's a year of severe economic recession, actually in some ways similar to what we're experiencing now, but with a really high inflation and an oil crisis. And the Democrats, there's a sense that kind of the traditional Keynesian model of economics isn't working anymore, and there needs to be a new solution. And that solution to kind of economic growth, or the solution to that is economic growth, especially of kind of new sectors of the market, really, and so new sectors of the economy, and sort of using these kind of the market such to kind of build the kinds of growth that they think is critical to the economy. And I would say one thing, this also goes to the answer of what makes them different than Republicans. So the Watergate babies then become called the Atari Democrats, and then briefly they're called neoliberals, then they get called the New Democrats. It's a whole chain of terms. They see the market as a way to kind of achieve their traditional liberal goals. So it's still the idea that if we can use market techniques and grow the economy and economic growth, that can still achieve ideas of opportunity and equality and the types of things the Democratic Party has long stood for. So it's a different use of the market than the Republicans at the same time, or conservative thinkers, are thinking about why the market is a good idea.
So some of the programs and policies that you go to dive into in depth are very familiar to us, are like welfare reform and housing, public housing policy. But there's also, you talk a great deal about the really important model of microfinance and the influence of those programs, particularly on the Clintons, both Bill and Hillary Clinton, and how that story unfurls. It was a really interesting transnational story. Can you talk more about that piece of why that figures so prominently and so important?
Yeah. So one of the programs the book tracks is this embrace of microcredit. And actually, this also was influenced by my students. And so I sound like I'm just stealing my ideas all from my students, but they do often have really good ideas. But my students were really interested in that was the program actually they were the most interested in, is microcredit. And after having an office hours appointment, I Googled Clintons and microcredit and started to do some more digging and came up with this much bigger story about the Clintons' relationship to microcredit. So the Clintons were longstanding advocates. And so for those of you who don't know what microcredit or microenterprise is, it's the idea of giving small loans to often to poor, especially women in the global South, such that they can start their own businesses and become self-sufficient. And this idea really hits its kind of apex in the early 2000s. I think it's the United Nations names it the International Year of Microcredit. The founder of this, what's seen as the biggest microcredit organization, is Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, and he wins the Nobel Prize. But the Clintons actually first learn about microcredit in the 1980s, and they learn about this program that Muhammad Yunus was running in Bangladesh to help poor women. And they become really interested in the idea that this could actually be used in the U.S. And so they invite, is when Clinton was governor of Arkansas, he invites Muhammad Yunus to Arkansas to start a program to help women women on welfare in the Arkansas Delta gain access, start microcredit programs. And so then this becomes actually really critical to the kinds of, the idea of it becomes really critical to the types of solutions that Clinton is going to sell when he becomes president. And so it becomes really big on his campaign trail, and then it's actually part of the welfare reform. Is like, we're going to use this as a new kind of solution. So we're going to turn poor women into entrepreneurs. And to me, it really stands for the kinds of market-oriented thinking that the New Democrats like Bill Clinton were promoting. This idea of like turning poor people into entrepreneurs, they can start their own businesses, and this is sort of a new way to kind of use the market to do good. And so in the book, I look a lot at the idea of doing well by doing good, and microenterprise is a kind of critical example of that.
So the vision that the Clintons and other centrists are putting forth, this market-based vision, of course, isn't the only one active in the Democratic Party at this time. And one really interesting character throughout the book is Jesse Jackson. Can you talk more about Jesse Jackson and how he figures into this story as a foil and as his arc and how?
Sure. So I would say Mike Dukakis, I was sort of tongue-in-cheek is not as interesting. Like, he's kind of boring, but Jesse Jackson is super interesting. And so he is actually in many ways the kind of foil to the New Democrats throughout much of their career. And I actually do think stands for a kind of alternative. And so one thing I was really interested in working on this project is sort of moments of sort of alternative paths that the party could have taken, and to think about the ways in which the kind of market-based thinking and market-oriented logic of Clinton and the New Democrats comes to take hold was a deliberate set of choices by the party at various different points, but there are other paths there. And Jesse Jackson is really this other figure who ran for president. So this might be weedsy, but Margaret, who's also a political historian, will get into this. Oftentimes people don't really take the 1980 elections that seriously. Like, they're not really that give it that much attention because the Republicans won both of them, and it's more seen as like Democratic losses. But actually, in both of those elections, there was pretty contentious primary campaigns with Jesse Jackson running a campaign that, in both 1984 and 1988, that really galvanized a lot of different groups, and especially a lot of marginalized people, to support and vote for him. And he had a really progressive agenda of kind of, he ran a universal health care. A lot of ideas of like full employment, a really generous welfare state, sort of a much more robust vision of social welfare. In many ways, there's actually like precursors to the kind of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren model in Jesse Jackson. And he was extremely critical of who become the Democratic Leadership Council or the New Democrats, and he called them the Democrats of the leisure class. He publicly came out against them. He and one of the founders of the DLC was Chuck Robb, and him and Jesse Jackson almost got into a fist fight at like a DLC convention. So, he was very contentious, and especially with Bill Clinton, they had a fraught relationship after the Sister Souljah moment, where which happened at Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. Jackson goes through somewhat of an evolution over the course of the 1990s, and so he becomes a really interesting figure to me because it sort of stands. I guess until it happened. By the end of the 1990s, he actually becomes like very supportive of Clinton's market-oriented programs. And so the book both opens and ends with this tour that Bill Clinton takes with the idea of kind of searching for new markets or untapped markets that it's a tour of bringing business executives to the places in the United States that they deem left behind. So to the rural South, to parts of like Appalachia, the Deep South, Watts, the Pine Ridge Reservation, to sort of show corporate executives like, look, you can invest here. And Jesse Jackson is like a very sort of active participant in this tour. And it's, in some ways, that speaks to the complexities of Jesse Jackson and his own sort of politics, and he'd always actually believed in had a more economic agenda. But the other thing that's really interesting is it addresses this issue of sort of what happens to the left or the more progressive movement within the over the course of the 1980s and 1990s. And there's not actually what that stands for to me is like Jackson opposed Clinton on various different things, but still at the 1996 convention came out in support of him. So he was protesting outside the White House after the welfare reform bill was passed, but then still at the convention gives an endorsement. And I think that one of the things that happens is that within the left, there's sort of protests against the Clinton administration on particular issues, but there's not a kind of unified pushback. And I think that actually contributes to this embrace of certain kinds of market thinking. So it's a different constellation that I think we see today.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. That's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating the arc. There's so many people, really important political figures in this book. So you have the Clintons, you have Jesse Jackson, Joe Biden's in there, Al Gore. But there are also people whose names aren't quite as well known. And I'm just curious, can you tell us about some of those characters in the book that you thought were particularly interesting, that really, either people that you got to know in the process of putting this book together, or that you think really help us better understand and illuminate these processes and changes?
Yeah, so one of the other things related to microenterprise that the book tracks is this organization called ShoreBank, which was a community development bank that was started in Chicago by this group of people who worked at a bank. And they had this innovative idea in the early 1970s of transforming basically taking a commercial bank and using the deposits to do economic development projects. They were trying to do kind of economic redevelopment, but using this idea. And it actually is in some ways a market-oriented thinking, but in ways that are really, really innovative. And Clinton learns about this program. They're actually who connect him to Muhammad Yunus, and he becomes really, really taken with it. One of his campaign ideas was that we're going to build 100 shore banks across the country, and that's going to be the kind of solution to economic redevelopment. And they really promote this idea. And actually, it's the bank itself, the organization growing substantially because they got so much attention. And so I look at them for a couple of different reasons. Is sort of understanding why Clinton became so taken with this idea. And this goes to the thing of genuinely believing in this idea, that there was this idea that that a bank could be the solution to redevelopment. And the idea is that if you have that bank there, then you don't need to you don't need other kinds of parts of the social safety net. So it can replace other kinds of sort of big government spending, if that was the way that Clinton thought about it. And what's interesting to me about ShoreBank, I'm not actually critical of the idea. I think it's a really interesting idea. I think the issue is that it can't replace the welfare state. And so it's an example to me of the ways in which the Clinton administration, with a lot of these programs, this goes more to the administration than the kind of New Democrats, but they really oversold what they were doing. They were selling sort of microenterprise or community development banking as the solution to this is going to solve the problems of poverty and inequality. And those kinds of things, those kinds of programs in and of themselves cannot solve poverty. And so I working on the book, I got to know the people who founded ShoreBank, and they're incredibly inspiring people. They gave me I should say they made me think much more highly of bankers than I ever have, but they're really interesting bankers. I think one of them's the only person. The founder, Ron Grzinski, is the only person the only banker to speak in favor of the Community Redevelopment Act. So, in Congress, and he's they really believed in that the banking system, that you could use the banking system in different kinds of ways. So those are people that I became really sort of inspired by, and I think in many ways their story speaks to this kind of question of overselling what they could do, and it leads to kind of the book tracks their evolution from this kind of overselling. And then the other people that are interesting who are not as well known, some of the kind of lower level officials in the administration, I think, who I think were working under sort of certain complex scenarios, and so I tried to sort of understand their position and point of view. But the other people who I didn't talk to but are in the book are a lot of the people that the New Democrats sort of promoted, and especially these poor people that they often promote as kind of indications of success. So they told a lot of success stories. So these individual women who had succeeded in micro enterprise programs, and I became really interested in how and why their stories got used. And it's not to villainize them for getting used in these particular ways, but it interested me why. The famous one is in welfare reform, Bill Clinton really promoted the story of this woman, Lily Mae Hardin. And so if you look at the picture of welfare reform being signed, she's standing next to him. I think he was telling her story starting in the 1980s, and it really interested me what happened to these people, their subjectivity in experiencing those types of things. So those are another set of people that I was interested in.
Yeah. So we're going to weave in audience questions as they come in. I have this fabulous iPad that's bringing things in, and so I'm going to keep asking some of my questions, but I'm seeing some really pertinent ones pop up, and I want to that I think are useful to ask now. So one questioner asks, "What was the most surprising thing you encountered during the research of your book?"
So one of the things I was really surprised by was, and this actually predates the Clinton years and is more the kind of rise of the New Democrats, was how hostile to organized labor they were. So I had sort of, in my first book, I had looked at kind of this question of the reorientation of the Democratic Party away from labor, and I saw that as more of a story of indifference, but I actually saw this as like a deliberate effort to kind of disentangle the Democratic Party from labor. So that really interested me. Another thing that really surprised me, and actually this goes to Margaret's work as well, is I have a chapter in the book on charter schools, and so it was the question of how early the Clinton and the Democrats were involved in charter schools, but also the tech industries, really, really early and active promotion of charter schools. So that was another thing that I was not anticipating finding, and in some ways like only confirmed my argument, but it was interesting to kind of see those were places I was surprised.
Yeah. No, you taught me things in that chapter that I didn't know about the depth of the involvement and so talk more about Silicon Valley and Clinton and how that factors into the story, these tech actors and tech interests and how they're shaping these ideas.
Well, I'll turn it into a true love fest because if anyone hasn't read The Code, it's a really fantastic book, but I relied on it heavily to understand some of these dynamics, and Margaret has wonderful discussions of this question of these kinds of alliances. So tech is involved really early, and so this goes to the kind of question of the types of economic growth that the New Democrats are promoting, and so where they see the economy should go, which is away from kind of the traditional kind of manufacturing-oriented base. So that goes back to this question of kind of the Keynesian crisis, that you can't rely on manufacturing industry. As the kind of salvation for the American economy, and so turning to new post-industrial sectors. This is a longer process, but especially become enamored by the tech industry. And so that's where they get their famous name in the early 1980s, coined by Chris Matthews, of calling them the Atari Democrats because of their obsession with tech. It wasn't Atari usually, but it was they were interested and they really interested in the tech industry. And so that is really critical to kind of what they're promoting. And in the 1980s, it's important in kind of their policy orientation, but it's also and kind of what they're promoting. It's also really important for winning over voters, and voters especially with ties to the tech industry. And so many of them lived in kind of or were represented districts that had a lot of tech workers in them. But then by the early 1990s, it actually becomes about a relationship with Silicon Valley. And I think especially this is where Al Gore fits in heavily. So in addition to, I guess, inventing the internet, he also, one of the things he was doing, he did in the Clinton administration was to really promote this idea. And I think actually he really did believe in this kind of technological future. And this is both for the economy, but for like the larger society, and sort of really brings that into the administration, but also cultivates these relationships with people in Silicon Valley. And so, there's an understanding that this is also be a critical donor base, and there's building up those kinds of supports. And in 1996, after the 1996 elections, so it's early 1997, Al Gore begins a close relationship with John Doerr, who is the managing director of one of the biggest venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. I would say in the 90s he was considered the most Margaret's the expert on this, but
and definitely the one with the strongest and strong ties to Washington.
He had strong ties. So he's this big at Kleiner Perkins, and so he and Gore started to have these sessions called the Gore Tech Sessions, where tech figures come to Washington and they would talk about talk policy, and then Al Gore would go to Silicon Valley. And I think I didn't do a sort of systematic study, but I think I noticed just observationally that Bill Clinton's visits to Silicon Valley increased substantially over the later part of the 1990s. So there's about this kind of much closer ties that start to develop. And especially on issues of education, it becomes a critical space for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another character that was also a technophile that is in the book, maybe not as prominently, but definitely is someone who is a foil and shapes the direction the second half of the Clinton, or most of the Clinton years, is Newt Gingrich. And again, like, how does a changing Republican Party and its control of Congress, both houses of Congress, after the 1994 midterms, which were not a good, not a good. The Clinton had 2 years of a Democratic Congress, and then the Republicans were in charge. How does that sort of play into this story? And maybe the one place where to focus on in particular would be, how does this shape welfare reform?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's one thing I always try to say, like, it's not like Bill Clinton. So in my saying that there was an affirmative project and that they believed in it is not to say that it was like a frictionless world. Like, so they were confronting I mean, I think first in the 80s, a very powerful presidency in the Reagan administration, and then after 1994, have real pushback in Congress. And I think that the place that this comes up is around welfare. And I think what's important about the welfare story, and so I do think it shapes things in various different ways. They're still operating and sort of making choices. Actually, charter schools I'll do the charter school example first because in some ways what the Clinton administration realizes is that the Republicans like Newt Gingrich are supporting vouchers in the 1990s, and that that things like charters were a way to kind of support choice and without going full voucher or going full privatization. So it's fine. It's not triangulation. It's actually finding some sort of space in which to kind of promote particular ideas. On welfare reform, it does. The initial package, and Margaret and I were talking backstage, and since she worked on it, can probably speak to this even more than I can. It was a more expansive, and I think had much more social programs connected in it. I mean, so it's not what there was a lot of negotiation and navigation, and the 1994 plan that Clinton proposed was much more comprehensive. And so you have this really fierce battle that occurs in 1995 and 1996 with Gingrich over welfare. And I think what happens, I mean, I think some of it is that the Gingrich and the congressional Republicans are pissed because Clinton that's the idea, that he took their best idea. So they had been fighting for years for welfare reform, and he basically, that's what he ran on 1992. He was gonna come in, and they were angry that he had basically stolen it. So come back with these just really fierce proposals, and Clinton does veto 2 of them. I mean, for how harsh the types of sort of policies that were in those bills, and then finally in 1996 passes something with this idea that this is the last chance. So I think that there's a compromise that I don't think it was clearly not what Bill Clinton fully wanted. Like, he didn't want to cut. I mean, the levels of the cuts, I don't think he would have put in marriage programs. Definitely would not have cut welfare for immigrants, which is like one of the parts that gets often not talked about, but is really, really severe. But I think the part and many people in the administration, I mean, 2 members publicly resigned. There was huge battles internally that was not like the whole Clinton administration supported this. But I think the thing that is important is that Clinton did run on welfare to work. Like, he did believe in work programs. And so it's not to say that it was like what he wanted was this really expansive welfare state idea. Like, welfare to work itself is a program that has, I'm trying to say this, I'm trying to think of the best way to say it diplomatically. I mean, it's a program that's incredibly punitive to women of color, and that was the idea. And it is a program that was meant to. I mean, he did say he was going to end welfare as we know it, meaning like, I'm going to end the federal welfare program. So I do think that part has to also be remembered, that what he was advocating for at the outset was a sharp difference and deviation from the kind of traditional welfare programs that had been in place, since the 1930s.
Yeah. And the title of the Welfare Act, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, whatever. It's the most 90s title ever, right? All those buzzwords that you talk about throughout the book, and this notion of, Yeah, making everyone, connecting people to markets is the way to, for them to fully realize their full selves. There's an empowerment message inherent in all of it.
Yeah, and that's part of it. And I actually do think the title speaks to that. Like those
Yeah.
are these core DLC New Democrat values of like we're giving people opportunities, they can get jobs, like the job, like working hard. And I do think like I based this on Jason DePerl has a wonderful book called American Dream about welfare reform, and he talked about Bill Clinton like really did think that there's psychic value in having a job. So it wasn't just about like we want to push women into off of welfare into work. Like he really believed in that idea, and that goes back to this idea of like the market is not just about is not just a mechanism of like making money or building wealth. It's also this like all these other kinds of things that can go with it that I think is part of their thinking as well.
Yeah, it's this entrepreneurial capitalism is a wider animating force, right? This be your own boss. That's the title of one of your chapters, and you note that that's something that informs the gig economy. These defenses of celebrations of you can be an Uber driver, you can be this is an empowering independence-making thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things actually goes back to the question around microenterprise. So microenterprise isn't successful in the United States. It really picks up internationally, and actually Hillary Clinton is who really promotes it internationally in the late 1990s. But what I argue in the book is I think actually where you see the basis of it is in the gig economy and these messages of like it's empowering entrepreneurship as a form of empowerment, and if you can do these types of things, and that gives you sort of the liberation from a waged economy job, and that's a lot of what was being sold. So this goes to this question of saying the same thing, like what's building wealth in these kind of close relationships to Silicon Valley of promoting that kind of entrepreneurship, but at the same time, like that can also be available to any poor woman in Arkansas if she just like works hard enough, without sort of thinking about the structural constraints of those two groups. And I think there's what I see as a real problematic is kind of lumping them together. That like I always say this, like the CEO of Uber and like who's now there's a Showtime show about the founder, is not, and like an Uber driver are not the same thing. Like they do not sit in the same kind of class status, and so that like there's real problems in that kind of slipping.
Yeah, and even Silicon Valley, someone starting a Silicon Valley startup is to be able to do that requires structural advantages and privileges. You need to be able to, not have other people depending on you, or maybe you have family and friends who can help seed, pay for the very beginnings. Like, Mark Zuckerberg's parents helped out at the very beginnings of Facebook. So those things are recognizing. I think that's one of the important things that you note in these championing these independent entrepreneurial models, and yet not giving. The broader structure is not there. It's a powerful lesson. I have a question came in sort of asking about, effectively, were you in the 1990s? This isn't too long ago. Kind of, watching this the Democrats unravel in real time or unfold in real time. Did you sort of have an awareness or of this history as it was happening, or how is it writing the history of something that you were alive for?
Yeah, it's a really hard question, and the other thing that's hard is like getting. I was trained as a historian, so getting the historical materials for it was actually a challenge in of itself. Yeah, and actually, in some ways, the question of sort of like was I like the lone high school student who was like no to everything that's going on? No, I think that in some ways I was. In many ways, I like came of age during this time, and that's a really interesting thing. Unlike writing like history, it's like far more distant. I wanted in some ways to understand like why I wasn't more outraged and why I wasn't more upset during that period. Even though I was young, but I think actually that's what a lot of people who've read the book feel. Like, why was there not more opposition or outrage? Like, this was all sort of part of this like larger message. And where did why wasn't there more critical thinking? I think a lot of that had to do, which is also really interesting with this moment of like we're in this cultural nostalgia for the 90s. So like, why is this a time that everyone like wants to go back to? That's what I've tried to understand too. I think a lot of that had to do with economic growth and also the idea that Democrats were in power. And after a period of like Democrats not being in power for so long, there was this moment of like, it was a Democratic decade. So those things came in. The moments that in the book that I remember most clearly, and this is why I focus on this, I actually want to think about friction, was I have a chapter on sweatshop abuses, and that being this kind of critical moment of opposition. So both in terms of sweatshops, but also in Seattle with the WTO protests, that is this kind of huge moment of people pushing back and saying like, we don't accept this kind of full scale support. So a huge part of the new economy, what Clinton was promoting was tech, but it was also trade. And so that part is the part that I remember the most clearly. But it is hard to write a period that you know. And I think the other thing that's hard is it's a period a lot of people know. So so you have, people have different perspectives on it, or it's hard to think critically about a time that you lived through. And I think it's both like in some ways the challenges and like fun part of doing recent history.
Yeah, and that the people that you're writing about can talk back.
Yeah, I know. I actually had a few times that I'm gonna like talk. My next book's about the 1920s.
Want everyone to be dead and gone. So one of the questions that came in asked about how you arrived at the title of the book, which is very provocative and illuminating, and the really beautiful cover design and what it's what it's telling us.
Oh, well, thank you. So both I have to give not credit to myself. So this, the title is, the title I've learned to love. The title for this book for a long time was Doing Good. And it was about this, I look at the book a lot at that idea of doing well by doing good and how that's a dominant ethos. So that's what I had thought the title was. My editor didn't like it. And so but he likes puns. And so we went through a lot of back and forth. But I talk in the book a lot about this idea of people being left behind, and that was this critical idea that like part of what these programs to address inequality and poverty were to help the people who were being left behind by the new economy. And I wanted to think about that idea of what does it mean to like people being left behind, that language, and then also this question of like the left being left behind too. So that's where we came to on the title. It's also the title of like a post-apocalyptic evangelical series. So my secret goal was to win those readers over too.
When someone's doing a search on Amazon, it pops up you.
Yeah. So they think there's a new book in the series and they buy it too.
Right.
So I think those sell better than this. But the cover came. I got to. Gave the wonderful designer some suggestions, and I had this idea of someone sweeping after a convention, like who does the work at a convention. And so I found a bunch of images of that. Or I found actually great images of people in cleaning Congress. And so I was like, wanted something like that. And then he came up with this. And it's interesting actually, the art director, he himself actually, it's crumpled pieces and he did the crumpling himself. So it's him or an intern, like crumpled all these images and then they took a picture of it.
That's great. I love it. There's so many pieces. I mean, this book is a work of history, but it also so much resonance for right now, and not only understanding the landscape of where we are today, but certain issues that we are still struggling over. And here in Seattle, one of the most pressing issues is the question of housing and affordable housing. And in the book, you talk about how the Clinton administration tried to tackle that, particularly public housing and replacing the implosion, tearing down of these giant superblock public housing projects and replacing them with lower density housing. Can you talk more about kind of what that, how that fits in and what the lessons are? I mean, what do we learn from that moment about what to do and what not to do in terms of providing housing for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have a chapter on the solutions to public housing. And I think this is one of those arenas that actually there's less attention to. So Clinton also ran on the idea of like ending public housing as we know it. So welfare gets a lot more attention, but public housing, and this is for the moments of the like late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a ton of attention to these big, the sort of big public housing development projects of that were built largely in the 1950s and 1960s as like the source of all sort of urban problems and crime and drugs and various different other things. And the kind of famous examples of these are in Chicago of Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes, which had gotten a huge amount of attention, especially in that moment of the early 90s. And the Clinton administration adopts a program called Hope 6. It's slightly adapted from the Bush administrations had a program with the same name, and they kind of used the name but changed the program. And the idea of it was, as Margaret brought up, was to replace public housing, these big public housing developments, with mixed income, low density townhouse style programs. And this is one place. So in a lot of the book looks at programs that weren't actually trying to make a profit, but public housing, this was explicitly about profit orientation, that you were going to kind of bring in mixed income housing. That was going to make the land itself and the housing more profitable, and kind of support various different things. And so it's a classic kind of public-private partnership. And it is what ends up happening in these programs is, so they take so Cabrini Green is the classic example of this in Chicago, which was sat sort of right off the loop in Chicago, and it was a long process to do this. But they basically HUD, in partnership with the city of Chicago, instituted Hope 6, where they took people out of their homes, and the idea was they could either get a voucher, which they could use on the private housing market, or they could potentially move back into one of these apartments. But they had very stringent rules about who could move back in. You had to apply. You had to have had very similar rules to welfare reform. You had to have a job. It had a similar name of, it's like the housing. Quality housing personal responsibility. It had responsibility and opportunities also in that title. Yeah. And it's also QWRO. I can't remember. It's in the book, but the idea of it for many of the people were not able to move back into their housing. Another part of it was that they had a one strike you're out policy if you were convicted of a crime or one of your relatives were. So anyone who had a relative who'd been convicted of a crime could move back into housing or get a Section 8 voucher. And this causes, I think many people look to this, especially in places like Chicago. Seattle had a program like this too, of contributing to larger scale gentrification of particular neighborhoods, because you're putting in this kind of particular style of housing. But also there was just a shortage of affordable homes. Like there was an abandonment of actually building, of a commitment to actually building government housing or government-supported housing for generations. And so this actually, I think, is something that's both Republicans and Democrats are heavily responsible for. So thinking about fast-forwarding to where we are with the affordable housing crisis, was this kind of promotion of the private sector, and the private sector is solving the solutions, has not, and it's only intensified the problem that there's a massive shortage. Section 8 cannot adequately address the number of people, in LA, there's a, I don't know what it is in Seattle, I know LA better, but there was it's over 100,000 people are on the wait list for a Section 8 voucher. Mm-hmm. So it just is it can't match the solution to the problem. The other thing that the Clinton administration puts a strong emphasis on is homeownership. And so there's an idea of also helping people in public housing buy homes, but just more broadly opening up homeownership and making that more widely available. And there's roots of that program, it's called the National Homeownership Strategy, in the foreclosure crisis, because it was sort of it was giving a lot of incentives to the mortgage industry to try to help them to get people to purchase homes, which then coupled with other forms of deregulation becomes a combination of things that lead to those types of things. So that also has contributed in many ways to the foreclosure, both to the housing crisis I think we're experiencing today. I think some of it's the aftermath of that as well.
Yeah, I was reading your chapter that's discussing kind of the passage or the effectively the dismantlement of the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial and investment banking, which is keys up the crisis of 2008. At the same time that these homeownership and it's kind of like a disaster movie where you see the asteroid coming. You're like, this is not going to end well, and this is a perfect storm.
Well, and I think that goes to, I don't think that the Clinton administration knew what they were doing. There's not, so I like give them, it is like, it's when you watch it, sort of see it happen, how all those pieces sort of came together. And I think, another thing I think was going on, and so this goes to one of my other kind of critiques or things I think about, I think it's true of housing. I think it's true of all of these programs, but it was a reliance on the market, but the market itself or sectors of the economy that were changing rapidly over this time. So especially like sort of turning to the banking sector to or finance to sort of solve problems. Like banking changed radically over the course of the 1990s. So you're actually you're expecting a system to help that itself was increasingly unstable, and so I think that actually contributes to this. The question that I have at the end is like, why are people? Why do you have by the end of the 1990s a sense of like broad scale prosperity, but people, you have low income people in a much more vulnerable position than they had been under previous Democratic administrations.
Yeah. So one of the I wanted to. We have a couple of questions kind of about the making of the book, which I think are it's always interesting to ask authors now that they're done. And so first, kind of, I asked you at the start kind of why you wrote this, what brought you into this, and maybe a kind of related question coming in is kind of what got you into this. The study of this period and these set of actors generally, which really, there's connective tissue between your first book and this one, and perhaps, interested in where you see this going next. And in terms of this book, when did you know you were done? When was your writing process? When did you feel like I've told the story now and I'm ready to move, take this away?
Those are it's interesting questions to think back on the process. I mean, it's funny because there's a thing, I was always told like where you start and end a book is really important. And so that shapes the story. And so one thing actually, to go to the question of like why I wanted to write about this period, I didn't actually just want to write about this period. I wanted to position it in a broader story. So to not say, to understand that it's not just a story about the Clinton administration, or like I met with an early editor who was like, you're going to write the story of the Clintons, and I was like, I don't want to write their biography. That was never what I set out to do. I really wanted to think about how they were, what sort of shaped them in many ways, and what they came to shape about the Democratic Party, but it's also about policy more broadly, like what happened with the policies that were instituted during this time period and how they sort of reflect this broader trend that was going on. So that was sort of what got me interested in this this particular period. And I think in some ways it was just that there was not particularly critical accounts. Like, so my broader, I've always been really interested in the kind of contradictions and limitations of liberalism in the Democratic Party, but also trying to understand that, and this is both my books do this, about like that the Democratic Party is not, it's not a decline and rise story. It's about like a transformation of the party. And so that was one thing I was trying to get at too, like how is the Democratic Party transformed over this period, and what does that mean for kind of today? And the question of being done, I guess that's really hard. I mean, there's deadlines, so those sort of shape it. And pressures and small children who only would let me do a certain amount. I think it was that I sort of felt like I have more to say, or that like there was one thing, I mean, this goes to another question of like, what did I leave out and why? Yeah. And so I was planning actually to do a chapter on the environment. And I just didn't, it was, one thing that was actually really challenging in this book is it's on a lot of different policy arenas. And I was like, I don't know if I can learn another policy arena. So I decided that like I want to write an article about the environment and cap and trade and those kinds of programs, but like it didn't necessarily work in this book. So some of that was like figuring out like what worked in the book and what didn't. And so that's sort of where I got to at the end. Yeah. I also, to be honest, I finished it on a sabbatical and I really didn't want to write it over the semester when I was teaching. So that was another, so that was another reason. Yeah. So that's the real behind the scenes reason.
Yeah, you're right over the day job, which is a challenge. Yeah, it's extraordinary, to get it done, even when you don't have a day job. Well, we're coming to the close of our time, and I was really compelled by at the end of the book, you say simply, this shows how ideas and policies have power, and also how they can change. So, this is a story of things left behind, right? Of choices made, perhaps not consciously realizing what wasn't being fixed. Hope things that were promises that were not met, and maybe they were impossible to meet. So, what are the ideas and the policies for now that we need to think about? What can we take from this in terms of what 2022 and beyond look like?
Yeah, so, and thank you, and that it shows that Margaret made it to the end of the book, which is a good thing. I mean, a couple of things. One thing I wanted to impart too is like not just to blame everything on the Clinton, like to expect one administration to change everything. So to sort of everything falling on the Clintons is one problem, but then also not to expect Biden to come in and do everything, like fix all problems. But I do think like the thing that got me interested in policy history was that like when you study policies, like they're really important, but they can also change. Like they're not natural. They come in. There's the possibility for change. And so I think actually, I mean, in some ways, it's about reviving for Biden. It's about reviving the social safety net and beginning the long process of repairing it. I think that one thing that both the pandemic really brought out is how just frayed it is, and so efforts to kind of bring things in. I think that I think that many of the things that the administration, I do think there's aspects of Build Back Better that can do that and begin that process. I think all of the pandemic relief actually showed that like it is capable for government to take steps. I think some of the other things to actually help people and sort of provide that kind of social safety net, not just in crisis situations, but the long term. I think the other thing the book wanted to show is efforts to kind of two things. One is to kind of restore the separations between the public and private sectors. So that goes back to things like Glass-Steagall, but that like part of what this was like expecting the market and the private sector to do various different things to kind of think about the real separations between those two arenas and to rely more on government. And the other is to kind of restore some of those groups that got left behind, like the labor movement, as this kind of critical force. I do think Biden has made some efforts, more so than other recent Democratic presidents, to kind of show more support for the labor movement, but I think that is a critical force in kind of bringing that. Oftentimes when there's a powerful labor movement are moments when there can be more social equality. So that's another thing that I think is important.
Yeah.
But I'm thankfully not the president. I think I came away from this thing that's a really challenging. The process of doing policy can be really challenging.
Yeah, it's a really hard job, and no one has any preparation for it to be president. Well, Lily, this has been such a pleasure, and thank you for giving us this book. I think this is a book that's important right now. It's going to be important for a while, and I hope it inspires even more work on this era and these people and the way that the 90s made the world that we have today in many ways. So thank you so much for coming to Seattle. It was great having you here.
Oh, well, thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. And thank you to everyone who came out in person and online for coming too.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.